Late at night, the city was a sprawling concrete jungle with lights that twinkled like stars in an earthly firmament. Encased within this vast urban expanse was a series of apartment buildings. Apartment 27A, an austere residence occupying the seventh floor of an old, crumbling building, was my new abode. Recently divorced, I had moved in with the hope of starting anew. Little did I know of the macabre events that were to transpire. My first night, I remember being captivated by the panoramic view of the city from the living room window. The apartment across the street was at level with mine, a mirror image of my own solitude. I occasionally caught a glimpse of my neighbor, a stern man with a long, scarred face and unsettlingly cold blue eyes. He lived alone, as far as I could tell, and seldom turned the lights on. Something about him screamed oddity, but I brushed it off, attributing it to my heightened sense of apprehension. On a fateful Friday night, I found myself gazing out at the sleeping city. Suddenly, I saw a woman stepping into the apartment across mine. Her red dress was striking against the otherwise dreary backdrop. She had an enchanting smile, a stark contrast to my neighbor's icy demeanor. I saw them conversing, though I couldn't hear the dialogue. I was a silent observer, watching the scene unfold. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. His stern face turned menacing, the smile on her face diminished. His hands began to move frantically, his voice seemed to be rising, and she backed away, fear apparent in her eyes. The next moment was a grotesque tableau. The man pulled out a shiny object from his pocket, a knife, gleaming under the harsh apartment lights. I gasped as I saw him lunge towards her, the fear in her eyes reflecting my own terror. The red of her dress turned a deeper shade, her screams soundless but palpable. I was paralyzed, a cold sensation of horror gripping my heart, but I had to act. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I described the grim scene unfolding before my eyes, I heard the sirens approaching. I prayed they weren't too late. To my utter shock, the man, upon hearing the sirens, stumbled into his living room, blood staining his clothes. He looked directly at me, his cold, blue eyes meeting mine. My blood froze. His stare bore into me, sending a chill down my spine. He knew I had seen everything. The police arrived, finding the woman still alive but barely hanging on. The man, however, was nowhere to be found. I watched as they cordoned off the apartment and a medevac airlifted the woman to a hospital. Her hauntingly terrified eyes remained seared into my memory. The following days were filled with paranoia. Every knock, every phone ring sent a jolt of fear through me. I feared the man would return, but he never did. The police reassured me he had fled the city, but it did little to quell my fears. Several weeks later, I received news that the woman had survived. She was recovering, and her testimony had been instrumental in identifying her assailant, who was now on the most wanted list. Despite the unsettling events, there was an odd sense of relief. I felt a renewed sense of courage knowing that my actions had saved a life. That apartment across the street remained a chilling reminder of that night. In the quaint little town of Eldridge, Nebraska, nestled amidst the rustling cornfields, there exists a bizarre annual tradition. On the eve of each year's harvest, when the moon hangs low and orange in the sky, the town congregates in the town hall, holding a vigil until dawn. They call it the Night of the Harvest Watch. Outsiders consider it quaint, even charming, but the people of Eldridge know better. It's not tradition, it's survival. The tradition started after a string of odd occurrences and sudden disappearances in the town many decades ago. Elders speak of the Shadow Eater, a spectral entity from a time before the town existed, a creature drawn to the darkness within the human heart, feeding off fear, despair, and loneliness. It was said to come with the harvest moon, an eerie omen that blanketed Eldridge with dread. Our protagonist, John McKenna, a disillusioned journalist from New York, arrived in Eldridge, drawn by the allure of the mysterious tradition. He hoped to reignite his stagnant career, believing that the fears of Eldridge would make an enticing story. That evening, as the townsfolk huddled together in the town hall, John chose to observe from afar. He stationed himself in a small inn that overlooked the hall. As midnight drew near, he felt a shift in the air. It became dense, almost tangible, carrying an undercurrent of fear that made his hair stand on end. The townsfolk's fear wasn't baseless superstition. It was palpable, bone-deep, and real. Suddenly, a cry echoed from the town hall. John rushed to his window, his heart pounding. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, had enveloped the building. It seemed alive, shifting, and contorting. Panic-stricken cries filled the night as the Shadow Eater made its presence known. Barely thinking, John grabbed his camera and ran towards the hall. This was the story of his career. As he approached, the air grew colder, the fear thicker. Suddenly, the front doors burst open, and out stumbled a man, his face twisted in terror. The darkness pursued him, wrapping tendrils around him, pulling him back towards the hall. Then John felt it, a coldness creeping into his heart, a bleakness that threatened to consume him. His deepest fears began to surface, their intensity magnified tenfold. The fear of failure, of dying alone and unloved. It was the Shadow Eater, reaching into him, finding the darkness within his heart. Driven by a sudden realization, John lifted his camera and snapped a picture. The flash cut through the darkness like a knife. The shadow shrieked, recoiling from the sudden light. It released its victim and retreated, disappearing back into the night from whence it came. The vigil ended. The townsfolk stepped out, looking shaken but relieved. John understood then. The vigil wasn't an act of fear, it was defiance. A stand against the darkness that threatened to consume them. The Shadow Eater, he realized, fed not only off fear, but off loneliness and isolation as well. The unity of the townsfolk was their defense, their shared fear their shield. The Harvest Watch wasn't about avoiding the shadow, but confronting it. The story John wrote was different than he intended. It wasn't about a town living in fear, but a town standing united against it. His article earned him widespread acclaim and reignited his career, but he chose to stay in Eldridge. The experience had changed him, teaching him the power of unity and the strength that came from confronting his fears. Every year, when the harvest moon shone in the sky, John would stand with the townsfolk, no longer an observer but a participant. The Shadow Eater still came, but now it faced a town unwilling to be consumed by their fears. The park was bathed in an eerie moonlight, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced with every rustle of the wind. A young man, barely 18, sat alone on a park bench, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of a life that was not his own. I watched him from a distance, my heart pounding in sync with the one I had lost. The heart, Mary's heart, was beating inside this young man. It was a chilling thought, one that filled me with a strange mix of grief and determination. I approached him, my footsteps muffled by the soft grass. He didn't see me until it was too late. I struck swiftly, a small, sharp blade in my hand. It was over in seconds. I left his lifeless body on the bench, a small incision in his chest, the only sign of my gruesome act. The heart, still warm, was now in my possession. I hadn't always been this way. I was once a man of action, a private investigator who had seen the worst that humanity had to offer. But nothing could have prepared me for the loss of my wife, Mary. The car accident was sudden, brutal, and left a gaping hole in my life that I couldn't fill. Mary was vibrant, full of life and love. Her laughter filled our home. Her love filled my heart. She had always wanted to be a mother, but medical complications had made it impossible. In the aftermath of her death, I learned that Mary's organs had been donated. A part of her was still living, still giving, even in death. This thought consumed me, gnawed at me until I could think of nothing else. I had to bring her back, piece by piece, organ by organ. The heart was just the beginning. The liver, the kidneys, each organ was tracked down with the same ruthless efficiency I had once used to hunt down criminals. Each organ was retrieved with surgical precision, leaving a trail of bodies in my wake. Each retrieval was a horror show of its own. The terror in the eyes of the recipients as they realized what was happening, the life draining from them as I claimed what was once Mary's. As I collected each organ, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I was bringing Mary back, fulfilling her wish to give life. But with each life I took, a part of me died. I was becoming a monster, and I knew it. I looked at the organs, each one carefully preserved in a glass jar. The heart, the liver, the kidneys. Each one a part of Mary, each one a part of me. And as I looked at them, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I had brought Mary back, in a way, but at what cost? The police had found me in my home, surrounded by the organs I had collected. They had arrested me, charged me with multiple counts of murder. I was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The prison cell was cold, the walls closing in on me. I could hear the distant sounds of the prison, the clanging of bars, the muffled voices of guards. But all I could think about was Mary, her laughter, her love, her life. All gone, all lost. And all I had left were her organs, her pieces, her parts. I could still remember the smell of her perfume, the sound of her voice, the touch of her skin. I could still remember the way she looked at me, the way she loved me. And so, as I lay on the execution table, the lethal injection ready to end my life, and I thought about the lives I had taken, the lives I had destroyed, but I felt no remorse. I had done it for love, for Mary,